What if I told you that Ireland released 20,000 red deer into mountains that had been lifeless for over 150 years, and experts predicted total disaster within months? It sounds impossible, right? Well, Ireland actually did this, and the result after 15 years shocked even the most optimistic conservationists. Mountains that couldn't support a single large mammal became home to thriving herds. Forests that had been destroyed for centuries began regenerating without human intervention, and an entire region's economy transformed from poverty to prosperity. This is that incredible story. To understand why Ireland would attempt such an ambitious wildlife restoration, we need to go back several centuries. Picture this. Ireland in the 1600s was a completely different landscape. Red deer roamed freely across every mountain range. Ancient oak forests covered the hillsides. The ecosystem was balanced, diverse, and self-sustaining. These weren't just any deer. Red deer are Europe's largest land mammals, standing up to 4 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing over 500 pounds. They were the architects of Ireland's mountain ecosystems. But then came the clearances. During the 17th and 18th centuries, British colonial authorities systematically destroyed Ireland's forests. Trees were cut down to build ships for the Royal Navy. Ancient woodlands were cleared to create pastures for sheep. And the wildlife, it was hunted to near extinction. By 1700, red deer had completely vanished from most of Ireland. The few remaining populations clung to existence in tiny, isolated pockets. The impact was catastrophic. Without deer to browse vegetation, certain plants grew unchecked. Without their grazing patterns to maintain open meadows, scrubland took over. The soil quality declined. Biodiversity collapsed. What had once been vibrant, living mountains became barren wastelands. By the 1800s, Killarney's mountains were essentially dead zones. Sheep farming had taken over, and it was brutal on the land. Sheep cropped vegetation right down to the roots, unlike deer who browse selectively. The soil eroded, native plants disappeared, and without the natural ecosystem, the land could barely support even the sheep that were destroying it. For 150 years, this was just accepted as normal. People forgot what Ireland's mountains had looked like when they were alive. The few remaining deer, maybe 200 animals total across the entire country, survived only because wealthy estates kept them as hunting trophies. Nobody thought about restoration. Nobody imagined the mountains could ever support large wild populations again. Then came 1979. A young wildlife biologist named Dr. Fergal O'Gorman was surveying Killarney National Park when he made a disturbing discovery. The park, supposedly protected since 1932, was dying. Plant diversity was at an all-time low. Bird populations were crashing. The famous oak woodlands were aging with no young trees to replace them. Without natural herbivores to maintain the ecosystem, everything was out of balance. But O'Gorman wasn't ready to accept this fate. He'd been studying successful deer reintroduction programs in Scotland. There, estates had brought back red deer populations with remarkable results. Forest health improved, biodiversity increased. The ecosystem started functioning again. Could the same approach work in Ireland? The idea seemed both brilliant and insane. Killarney National Park covered 26,000 acres of mountains, lakes, and remnant forests. Scientific surveys suggested the land could support maybe 2,000 deer maximum. But O'Gorman proposed something far more ambitious, releasing 20,000 animals over a 15-year period. That's 10 times what experts believed possible. His reasoning was radical. In Scotland, small reintroductions had failed because populations couldn't establish breeding herds large enough to trigger ecosystem changes. You needed critical mass, enough animals to create impact across the entire landscape simultaneously. Half measures wouldn't work. It was all or nothing. The proposal hit the Irish government's desk in 1982, and the response was immediate and brutal. Environmental scientists called it ecological suicide. Agricultural authorities warned of disease spread to livestock. Economists predicted the deer would destroy the region's sheep farming industry. Media headlines screamed about Bambi's revenge and deer apocalypse. Dr. Caitlin Murphy from Trinity College Dublin published a scathing critique. Releasing 20,000 large herbivores onto land that currently supports minimal wildlife is not conservation. It's creating an artificial crisis. These animals will starve. They'll destroy what little vegetation remains. And when the population crashes, we'll have wasted millions of pounds on an ecological disaster. The criticism was relentless. Public hearings in County Kerry turned into shouting matches between farmers and conservationists. Sheep farmers feared losing their livelihoods. Tourism operators worried about dangerous animals. Even environmental groups split on the issue, some calling it visionary, others calling it reckless. But O'Gorman had one powerful ally: the Irish government's new environmental minister, who saw potential beyond the criticism. Ireland was trying to rebrand itself internationally. Restoring native wildlife could become a point of national pride. It could attract tourists. And unlike industrial projects, it might actually work with Ireland's landscape instead of against it. In 1984, the decision came down. The project was approved, but with strict conditions. Deer would be released in phases. Population monitoring would be mandatory. And if catastrophe struck, mass starvation, ecosystem collapse, disease outbreaks, the program would be terminated immediately. The logistics were mind-boggling. Where do you even get 20,000 red deer? You can't just order them online. The team had to source animals from estates across Scotland, England, and the few remaining Irish populations. Each deer had to be captured, health tested, tagged, transported, and carefully acclimated. The first release happened in spring 1985. 50 deer were transported to Killarney in specially designed trucks. Wildlife vets monitored them around the clock. Conservationists held their breath. Would the animals survive? Would they stay in the park? Would they immediately destroy the fragile vegetation? For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. The deer explored their new territory cautiously. They found water sources. They began browsing on vegetation. Monitoring teams reported stable behavior. Maybe this would work after all. Then came summer 1985, and the first crisis hit. 20 of the original 50 deer died within 3 months. Post-mortem examinations revealed parasites, stress-related conditions, and malnutrition. The land couldn't support them as expected. Critics pounced. "We told you so. This is exactly the disaster we predicted." But O'Gorman and his team refused to give up. They adjusted the release strategy. Instead of small groups, they began releasing larger herds, 200 to 300 animals at a time. The theory: larger groups would establish natural social structures faster, reducing stress. They'd also create more significant browsing patterns that could actually stimulate vegetation growth rather than destroy it. By 1987, nearly 3,000 deer had been released. And something unexpected started happening. The mountains began changing. Areas that had been dominated by tough, unpalatable grasses were being browsed down, allowing other plants to emerge. The deer's selective feeding habits, unlike sheep, created a mosaic of different vegetation zones. Open meadows appeared in some areas. Dense shrublands developed in others. The landscape was becoming more diverse. Scientists monitoring the project noticed another change. Bird populations were increasing. Species that hadn't been seen in Killarney for decades suddenly reappeared. Why? The deer were creating habitat diversity. Their browsing patterns opened up areas where ground-nesting birds could thrive. Their droppings enriched the soil, supporting more insects, which fed more birds. An ecological cascade was beginning, but not everything was positive. By 1990, with 8,000 deer now roaming Killarney, new problems emerged. Some herds were venturing outside park boundaries, eating crops on private farmland. Road accidents increased as deer crossed highways, and in some areas, browsing pressure was indeed too intense. Young trees were being eaten before they could establish. The criticism intensified. Farmers demanded compensation for crop damage. Insurance companies raised rates due to vehicle collisions. Local newspapers ran stories about the deer invasion causing chaos. The government faced pressure to reduce the population or even terminate the program. The project team responded with adaptive management. They installed wildlife corridors to channel deer movement away from roads. They created buffer zones at park boundaries where vegetation could regenerate. They even hired gamekeepers to manage population distribution, not through culling, but through careful monitoring and strategic placement of mineral licks and water sources to encourage deer to stay in optimal areas. By 1992, the program had released 12,000 deer, and researchers began seeing something remarkable in the data. Forest regeneration was accelerating beyond all predictions. Oak seedlings that had failed to establish for 50 years were suddenly growing successfully. The reason? Deer were browsing down the dense understory plants that had been suppressing tree growth. They were creating the exact conditions young oaks needed to thrive. Dr. Sarah Brennan, a botanist studying the forests, was stunned. "We've been trying to replant these woodlands for decades with minimal success. We thought deer would make it worse. Instead, they're doing what centuries of human intervention couldn't. They're restoring the natural cycle of forest regeneration." The economic data was equally surprising. Tourism to Killarney had increased 40% since the reintroduction began. Hotels were fully booked during deer viewing season. Specialist tour operators were offering wildlife safaris. Photographers from across Europe were coming to capture images of Ireland's restored wildlife. The deer had become County Kerry's most valuable asset. By 1995, with 16,000 deer released, Killarney National Park had been transformed. Satellite imagery showed dramatic changes in vegetation patterns. Biodiversity surveys found species counts had increased by 300%. The park was functioning as a complete ecosystem for the first time in over 150 years. But the most shocking discovery came in 1997. A team of ornithologists studying bird populations found something they couldn't believe: white-tailed eagles. These massive raptors had been extinct in Ireland for over 200 years, yet here they were, nesting in Killarney. How did they get there? Nobody had reintroduced them. They had simply returned on their own, drawn by the restored ecosystem. Further investigation revealed an incredible story. The eagles had been breeding in Scotland. As news of Killarney's restored ecosystem spread through conservation networks, researchers realized the deer had created conditions that could support the eagle's prey base. Small mammals and fish populations that had exploded with the ecosystem restoration. The eagles had naturally recolonized, following the food. This sparked an international sensation. Conservation scientists from 37 countries visited Killarney to study the restoration. What Ireland had achieved seemed impossible by conventional wisdom. You weren't supposed to restore a complex ecosystem by flooding it with 20,000 large herbivores. But it had worked, and the implications were massive. By 2000, the 15-year program concluded with the final releases, bringing the total to 20,000 deer. Population surveys showed approximately 18,500 had survived and established breeding populations. Genetic diversity was strong, health indicators were excellent, and most remarkably, the carrying capacity concerns had proven unfounded. The land wasn't supporting 20,000 deer, despite its limitations. The deer had increased the land's capacity by restoring ecosystem function. The numbers tell an incredible story. Before 1984, 200 deer total in all of Ireland, biodiversity indices at historic lows, tourism revenue struggling. After 2000, 18,500 deer thriving in Killarney alone, biodiversity increased 300%, tourism generating 450 million annually for County Kerry. The economic return on investment was estimated at 4,500%. For every pound spent on reintroduction, the region gained £45 in economic benefit. But perhaps the most significant impact was scientific. The Killarney project proved something revolutionary about ecosystem restoration. You do not need to perfectly replicate historical conditions. You don't need to gradually rebuild from the ground up. Sometimes, reintroducing a keystone species at scale can trigger cascading changes that restore the entire system. This became known as the Killarney model of restoration ecology. The principle is simple but powerful. If you can identify the missing element that historically structured an ecosystem, reintroducing it at sufficient scale can catalyze natural recovery processes. The ecosystem essentially repairs itself. Other countries took notice. Scotland expanded its deer restoration programs. Wales initiated similar projects. Norway, Sweden, and Germany all launched programs inspired by Killarney's success. Even North America started reconsidering approaches to elk and caribou restoration. The Killarney model had gone global. Today, Killarney National Park is recognized as one of Europe's most successful conservation projects. The deer population has naturally stabilized at around 17,000 animals, below the released number, but in perfect balance with the ecosystem. Forest cover has increased 40%. Native plant species have returned. And the white-tailed eagles. There are now 23 breeding pairs, with young birds dispersing to recolonize other parts of Ireland. The economic transformation has been equally dramatic. County Kerry has become Ireland's premier wildlife tourism destination. The region employs over 3,000 people in conservation-related tourism. Property values near the park have increased 200%. And sheep farming? Rather than being destroyed, it adapted. Farmers now market Killarney lamb as premium products from deer-grazed pastures, commanding higher prices in Dublin and European markets. The project also delivered unexpected climate benefits. Restored forests in Killarney now sequester an estimated 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide annually. The regenerated peatlands, which had been degraded by overgrazing, are now functioning carbon sinks. Ecosystem services that would cost hundreds of millions to replicate through human intervention are being provided naturally by the restored landscape. Critics who predicted disaster have, for the most part, become supporters. Dr. Caitlin Murphy, who published that scathing 1982 critique, wrote a follow-up paper in 2005 titled, "When Being Wrong Leads to Being Right: Lessons from Killarney." She acknowledged that conventional ecological wisdom had been incomplete. Large-scale, bold interventions could work when properly designed and adaptive management was applied. The Killarney story raises profound questions about conservation. For decades, the prevailing approach was cautious, gradual, and risk-averse. Small pilot programs, careful monitoring, slow expansion. But Killarney succeeded precisely because it rejected that approach. It went big, fast, and bold. And it worked. Today, Ireland is planning even more ambitious projects based on Killarney's success. Proposals are on the table to reintroduce wild boar, expand deer populations to other mountain ranges, and even, controversially, consider eventually bringing back wolves to create a truly complete ecosystem. These ideas would have been laughed out of the room in 1984. Now they're serious policy discussions. The legacy of those 20,000 red deer extends far beyond Killarney's boundaries. They prove that ecological collapse isn't permanent, that landscapes written off as beyond saving can recover, that sometimes the boldest solutions are the right ones, and that nature, when given the right catalyst, has an incredible capacity to heal itself. What started as a controversial experiment dismissed as ecological madness became one of conservation's greatest success stories. The barren mountains of Killarney are now vibrant, living ecosystems. Species thought lost forever have returned. An entire region's economy has been transformed. And the world has learned that restoration at scale isn't just possible. Sometimes it's the only approach that works. The transformation continues today. Each year, researchers document new species returning to Killarney. Each season brings evidence of further ecosystem recovery. And each generation of deer born in these mountains represents a living link to Ireland's ecological past and a promise for its future. So what can we learn from Ireland's bold gamble on 20,000 deer? Perhaps that our instinct to play it safe, to move cautiously, to fear bold action. Sometimes that instinct is exactly what prevents us from solving the biggest problems. Killarney succeeded not despite its ambition, but because of it. The scale of the intervention matched the scale of the problem. And that made all the difference. What other ecological crises might benefit from the Killarney approach? Where else are we being too cautious when boldness is required? The 20,000 deer of Killarney challenge us to think bigger, act bolder, and trust nature's capacity for recovery. Because sometimes, the impossible is just the difficult that nobody's tried yet.